Hi, how are you? My name is Mario Garcia Lee, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Lighting Up Ventures. I'm really happy to be here with you today, and it is such a privilege to be invited to speak to you and also to have an opportunity to have a private sessions and help you on your entrepreneurial success. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself and the things that I think are important for you to achieve success in your entrepreneurial efforts. So first of all, I live here in Seoul with my family. These are my two kids, Hamin and Sorin. And I have been living here for a little bit over 10 years now, working with many technology entrepreneurs. My experience in technology dates back to Mexico. I started my career in IT consulting. My parents had an IT consulting firm, and I started working with them when I was a teenager. Some of the customers that I worked with at that time were Air France, KLM, Pepsi, and even Coca-Cola. And what I learned working for my father's company was that for companies to be successful and to be competitive in the market, it's not just enough to have great ideas, but it's about implementing new technologies and being productive and being effective in providing value to your customers. I started working with my dad's company when I was 13 years old. I was very young, and at that age, I was visiting some of these corporate customers. So it certainly was a unique and very early experience that I had to start getting involved in business. I graduated high school when I was 16, and I moved to Boston. I did my undergraduate degree at the Extension School at Harvard University. And while I was an undergraduate, I also joined the Taekwondo club. And I got my black belt there. And with some of my classmates during my time in college, we also applied and got accepted to do research at NASA. This is the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard University. I took my very first astronomy class in Phillips Auditorium, which is on the first floor of this building. And what was really special about this place was that it was the same building where Edwin Hubble had previously worked. And some of his work, you might know his name from the Hubble Space Telescope. Some of the work that he did, for which he gained a lot of recognition, was built upon the other researchers on his team. One of them specifically was Henrietta Leavitt. And the discoveries that she made to use the brightness of variable stars to measure the distances allowed us to use this as a measuring stick to really understand how large the cosmos is. And later on, Edwin Hubble used that technique to measure and find that the universe is expanding. Building upon that work, in fact, another group of researchers got the Nobel Prize in 2011 for their proof that the universe was accelerating, that the expansion was accelerating. And around this time that I was studying there, I also had a really unique experience. The professor of my astronomy class, Eric Chison, one day sent me an email saying, "Hey, I'm having a Nobel Prize winner, Leon Letterman. He's going to have lunch in my office, and I want to invite you for this lunch." I thought there would be 20, 30, 40 people to attend a lunch with a Nobel Prize winner. There were like 6 people there. I was starstruck to meet a Nobel Prize winner face to face. But what happened during the lunch to me was really unexpected, which is that he had just published a book along with his co-authors on chemistry. At that time, I was about 19 years old, and they were asking me what were my opinions on the future of education, of science, And to me, this was really eye-opening, and it's something that I really want to talk to you about, because even though you're just in college, and even though you're just getting started in your entrepreneurial journey, I really think it's important for you to think that you can have an impact, and you have an opinion, and you have the opportunity now to drive how your society can change through innovation. If a Nobel Prize winner believed when I was your age that I had a valuable opinion, trust me right now when I tell you, you have a valuable opinion, you have a role to play. Here are some pictures from Taekwondo. The picture for the test when I got my third dan, you can see there I've got 2 stripes. That I was already a second dan at that time. I got a third dan during that test with Master Peter Lee. And on the other picture, that's me in the INCTL All-Stars team. And in the summer of 2004-2005, I got a chance to train in Taekwondo with Olympic athletes. That time that I was doing Taekwondo at university was when I first started to become familiar with Korean culture, and it was through my relationships with people in Taekwondo that I ended up coming to Korea. Another thing that happened during Taekwondo, these are 2 of my best friends, these are my 2 best friends from the time that we did Taekwondo. We joined together, we got black belts together, and we also did that research at NASA together. Peter Lee, the master of the club, himself had done research a few years prior, and he told us about an opportunity to apply for NASA to do summer research. So we applied together, we got accepted, and we went to NASA. This is a picture inside of the actual aircraft where we tested our new device. We got accepted to do research on new ways and new devices to do CPR in zero gravity. So the first lesson that I learned at that time that I want to share with you is that teamwork really, really matters. From my previous experience, I knew how to integrate technologies and work with vendors, so my job was to get all of our equipment together. You can see the laptop on the bottom left-hand side and all of our equipment to capture data. So I was the one that was in charge of making sure we had all of the hardware and the software that we needed, but I really relied on the rest of our team to do the different components. Definitely, I didn't have a background in life science, so other people did the elements for our experiment that relied on understanding the human body, and other people did the statistical analysis on the data that was captured, and other people helped us to work through the whole protocol. To apply for this opportunity, we had to go through very rigorous testing at NASA. That's Patrick right there presenting to the panel of evaluators who were testing the final safety test to make sure that we could actually test this equipment on a zero gravity flight and keep all of the safety conditions. So teamwork, it really, really starts with teamwork, and you have to have a team with a diverse set of skills that can work together to bring new ideas and new technologies into the market. As part of our proposal to NASA, a significant part of our score also depended on educational outreach. They didn't want us to just come do research and finish. They wanted us after the experiment to go out and share the results of our research and share our experience to try to encourage and promote people to study science at earlier stages, whether it was high school, middle school. We even visited some elementary schools, as well as to share our research findings with the professional community. This is a picture of a conference for aerospace medicine where we presented the results of our study. This was taken in San Francisco, and you know, one of the regrets of my life is in this picture because that's our advisor giving the presentation. And, you know, a few minutes before I took this picture, he was telling me, "Why don't you do it? Why don't you do it?" Honestly, I chickened out. I didn't feel I could be ready to present in front of a panel of professional surgeons and medical professionals. So he did the presentation, and as he was doing it, I realized I could have done the presentation and I could have answered all of the questions. So, you know, that was one of the earliest lessons that I had in the fact that you've got to get yourself out there and don't be scared to present in front of professionals. You'd be surprised how much you can really achieve, and you'd be surprised how capable you will find yourself if you prepare. after we did that research, and because of these experiences in going out to schools and professional conferences, I realized that there was a big gap. There was a very big gap between what we were doing in the research lab that was fascinating and involved a lot of advanced technologies and a lot of advanced analysis, and then what we actually could see in the marketplace that was maybe sometimes 10, 15, or 20 years behind what we were doing in the research labs. So I became interested in technology commercialization, and by then I also knew enough about Korea to understand that the country had developed very quickly from a technological point of view. So I wanted to come here, and it was through my connections in Taekwondo that I got a job as a researcher at Sejong University. I was doing research in astrophysics, and shortly after that I applied to the MBA program at Yonsei. After finishing my MBA, we tried a startup, and I was invited to join a group of participants, a group of institutions in the Korean entrepreneurship ecosystem to try to learn from MIT of how to foster entrepreneurial regions, entrepreneurial acceleration. So when I was at Sejong University, we were doing research off of the Spitzer Space Telescope, and what I noticed was that the computational power that we were using to analyze images was similar to what we were starting to see, in our cell phones at that time. This was around 2007, 2008. And I thought it was really interesting that what we had really been doing in research labs could soon be applied for advanced analysis in consumer devices. So that really accelerated my thinking about going into business. And when I was accepted to the School of Business at Yonsei, we actually participated in startup competitions, and we even filed a patent for a new device where we were applying some of the fabrics that were developed as part of the space program for bedding and curtains to help people be more comfortable in temperature in their own homes. So this was the first startup that I tried, and quite frankly, we didn't do so well. We learned a lot. We worked really hard. I'm very proud of the work that the team and I did, but we simply couldn't bring a product to market. And to be honest with you, what I realized was that even though we could say that we didn't bring it to market, because the technology was difficult, the technology we were trying to use was actually difficult to handle, and we didn't raise money, so it's the investors that don't want to invest in us. And we really couldn't figure out a way to sell and find customers. And it's very easy to say that this is because the technology is hard or the investors don't understand, but the real takeaway for us is that, it was up to us to learn and to really be able to handle the technology to take it to market. It's up to us to understand how to speak to investors. And it's really up to us to understand how to take products to the market. So when we had after the startup didn't work, I had this opportunity to join this group from South Korea that involved universities, government, corporations, and venture capital. We had institutions that were representing this, the Ministry of Finance, Sogang University, KTLG. We joined together as a group for the Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program at MIT. And there we learned from the MIT staff and faculty about how the entrepreneurship ecosystem has developed in and around the MIT region, specifically where they're located, which is Kendall Square. Something I want to share with you that I learned at that time is that when we were in the program, in the second cohort, there were 10 other countries with us. Now that there are 7 cohorts, you see there's groups from all over the world that have by now finished this program. Something that I found really, really interesting was that many of the participating teams from other regions in the world saw South Korea as an advanced country, and they even saw South Korea as a role model that they could follow. Many of the teams from other countries, when they were saying what we really want to see in our home countries is a company like Samsung, a company like Hyundai. These are global companies that are having a huge impact. And the truth is that here in South Korea, we have a lot of resources when it comes to technology, when it comes to financing, and when it comes to the ease and the ability to be able to take products to the market. Trust me when I say that people from all over the world, and these days after the pandemic, I think I can say that a little bit more strongly, that many countries around the world, when it comes to science and technology, they are looking to South Korea as a role model for how we can really use science and technology to integrate it into our economies. And so this brings me back to you. As I said, I really believe you have something to say, and I really believe you have something to do to change your society here in your home country. And from what I saw from this network of entrepreneurial regions that are being developed, I also think you have a very strong and very competitive advantage to take your innovations to the entire world. I really do believe that. So as part of this program, in the next few days, you will have the opportunity to sign up for one-on-one sessions. I can't wait to hear what it is that you're working on, and I really, really look forward to helping you to move along and to find the resources that you need to test your products, to grow your products, establish your companies, and then start thinking and finding a way to have a positive impact throughout the entire globe. When we were at MIT, they also gave us a chance to look at their educational curriculum. And what I did from seeing their overall educational curriculum, I kind of reworked it into this slide that you see now. And what is important here is that when it comes to entrepreneurship and innovation, it is not just about your technology and your product, and then maybe getting some financing from investors. That's not the only thing that you need to be thinking about. You actually need to build a business that can provide all of the supporting functions to take this product to the market in a way that is productive and profitable in the long term. So the organizing committee for this program, when they asked me, hey, can you come in and tell us, help people to really think, what does it take to build a business and take a new technology into the market? My answer to that would basically be what you see here. You've got to be thinking about all of these bullet points. Fundraising from investors is important, but that is only one part of business development. In fact, if you look at business development, right above that, what I think is even more important is recruiting. Do you have the right team that can handle the technology, the government processes, the analysis, the marketing? Do you have a broad-based team that can help you with everything else that you see on this slide? That, I think, should be your higher priority than financing from investors, because the truth is that professional investors, experienced investors, before they provide any investment in your company, they are going to ask you, who's your team? And when they look at your team, the second question is, and are they capable? Do they have the skills to do everything it takes to take a product to the market and build a business around it? Another area that I want you to take a look at here is the impact on the top right-hand corner. And this is because I believe that there's a misconception, not just in Korea, but I think everywhere in the world. There is a misconception that technology startups that are funded by venture capital and social ventures that are funded by impact capital, there is a very, very big misconception that those are two separate things in two different markets. And I think in most of the world, not just in Korea, people tend to see these things as two separate sides. But I'll tell you something about venture capital around MIT. I went to, as part of all of these activities at REAP, I went to a venture capital conference there where some of the top VCs from the United States were presenting. And time and again, what all of the VCs were saying, these were for-profit technology VCs. They weren't what they would call themselves, like impact capital. They were for-profit technology VCs, and every single one of them was saying, one of the key criteria for which we will invest in a new startup is their sustainability. And the reasoning was very simple, is that technologies themselves don't have value unless they are having an impact on society. If you want to be making big money in the future, you need to be selling a product that changes people's lives somehow so that you can continue to extract those large profits because people are continuing to buy and they're buying at an accelerated pace. Venture capital needs to be seeking impact. And the second thing about sustainability is that if your business is not sustainable, you're going to have two problems. Number one, you're going to have to keep on doing fundraising and eventually the bubble will burst. So your business model needs to be financially sustainable, and this comes from being sustainable in society. If you're not sustainable, your customers will eventually leave you, and if that doesn't happen, governments will eventually regulate you and your profits will disappear. So impact and sustainability are actually one and the same thing. They are criteria, they are components for all technology ventures. I mention this because for the last 5 years, I've had the pleasure of teaching courses and doing workshops at the top universities in Korea, including KAIST, Seoul National University, Yonsei University, I've been to Korea University, among others. And what has surprised me in a very good way is that the large majority of the students that I meet, their reason for engaging in entrepreneurship actually starts from wanting to see a change here in Korea, in their own home country, in their own society. So I think that this aspect of impact, it needs to be built into your business model from the very beginning. And I'm so glad to see that so many of you are actually, largely influenced by your ideas of positive impact. So I really look forward, and I hope that this is one specific area that I can help you when we do one-on-one sessions to really help you build a business model that integrates sustainability at its very, very core. So at this time, both through my own studies, by going to the university in Boston and then in Korea, and also having the pleasure to teach at universities here in Korea and having taught some workshops in the United States as well, I could tell you that there's a really big difference, I think, in the university environment. And this is what I visualize it like. Here in Korea, higher education really tends to follow the traditional lecture model. This is not a Korean thing. Most universities around the world do this. The professor is the authority, and they speak and they lecture, and the students, we sit and we listen and we memorize and we summarize. In Boston, when you go to university there, you will get a lecture, but remember what I told you, right? My professor called me into a lunch with a Nobel Prize winner, and they were asking me, what do I think? What's really, really unique about Boston and what makes it so productive in research, in innovation, in entrepreneurship, in economic growth, and in prosperity for the people that live there is that these hierarchies are not that strong, and people from a very young age actively participate, and people in a position of authority, they use their resources and their network to help lift you up and help you get farther. And I want to bring this up because this is how I want to approach the next few days with me. Don't think of me as someone who will tell you your idea is a good idea or a bad idea because I like it or because it compares well to other things that I have seen in my experience. That's not what I want to do. What I want to do is treat you the same way I was treated by my professors who helped me both at Harvard and at MIT by asking you, how can I help you? What do you need? What are your ideas for the change that you are trying to do? And how can I find a way to give you some feedback, some advice, maybe some constructive criticism, but most importantly, to point you in the direction of the resources that you will be able to use to actually achieve your own goals. When I started my first startup, straight out of Yonsei, I had an idea that I think many of you might have right now, which is that to build a successful company, what you need to do is have a great pitch deck, a lot of passion and energy, and present it to an investor. And when the investor gives you the money, that validates that you have a great opportunity that you're pursuing. That's not it. Now I know, and now I have learned, yes, pitching to investors is an important factor when you need to raise that capital, but that's not the most important thing, and that's not exactly the validation that you need. The most important thing is your team. How can you move through the group of students? You guys in this program already have a team, but how do you collaborate with other teams to help each other, to put resources together and find a way for each individual team to achieve their own success in the market? I am not the person that can tell you whether or not your business is a good business. And the truth is, investors can't do that either. Bill Ollett, the director of the Entrepreneurship Center at MIT, he wrote a book called Disciplined Entrepreneurship. I really highly recommend this book. If I could tell you if you had the opportunity to only buy one book about entrepreneurship, there's a lot of other things I could recommend you, but if you could only buy one and have one and keep it on your shelf, I would recommend this one, Disciplined Entrepreneurship by Bill Ollett. And there is also a Korean translation available as well that you can purchase. And what he says in this book is that the minimum and necessary condition to have a company is to have a paying customer. The validation that your business idea is a good idea does not come from investors. It does not come from judging panels at competitions. The validation that your business idea is a good business idea comes from the customers who are going to pay you for it. And in fact, 99% of all successful companies don't raise money from venture capital. Venture capital is an important tool that when you need it, it's great to be able to pitch and harness to bring the resources that you need for a fast expansion. But that's not the only thing, and that's not what defines your company. It's your customers and your market. We cannot simply come up with a new idea as a new technology and be done. We need to make sure that the new ideas and that the new technologies that we are developing, that they actually have an impact in the market. And the way that we do that is by engaging in marketing. It's a two-way process. You can start applying some principles of design thinking to test the market, to present a concept that you are working on and to gain feedback. Don't just build technology. Start with a concept, present it to your target market, and get feedback that it's actually solving a problem and that your implementation is worthwhile. And you iterate on this process, and it's important to present an opportunity to this target market and then extract some behavior. Some of you probably will be thinking that you want to raise venture capital funding, and I'll tell you that the good venture capitalists, they are not going to just look at your pitch deck as an idea. They're going to ask you, how have you validated your market? How can you show us real data that proves that what you have developed as a product, when presented to the market, will actually drive a purchase? In Bill's book, what he says is make a brochure. Before you even start building, make a brochure, make a concept, and start interviewing potential customers to see that this will actually solve their problems. There's another professor, he's from Stanford, Chuck Easley, and what he teaches in his course is that when you have this concept ready, make a website, install a payment gateway, and allow people for the opportunity to buy, to pre-buy, to pre-purchase your product for something as small as 1 cent. 1 cent of a US dollar, or 101 or 1,001. A very, very small purchase. Why? Because if people are willing to put that small money, sure, later on you need to really consider whether your final price is going to work, but the fact that they enter their credit card information, that proves they are interested and that they are willing to trust you. Now, if it's too early for that, you can have another behavioral test, which is simply gather email signatures. What we are trying to do with that process is to understand and validate the narrative, the story. We are also told that many times, the startup is about the founding team, and that is true. And your team's narrative is important, and how you present that narrative is critical for people to trust you and want to buy from you. However, here I'm not talking about your narrative. I am talking about your customer's narrative. And your customer's narrative has these basic elements, including a persona. The persona is the target profile of the customer whose problem you want to solve, their buyer's journey, and the full use case of the product that they are purchasing. So you can't just make a technology product available for purchase. You actually have to map out your entire buyer's narrative to understand how does this product fit into the problem they have and provide a valid working solution that they continue to benefit from even after they've put the product back in the box and aren't using it anymore. So we've got to understand our customer's narrative, and we've got to validate that in the market. So what are the tools that you can use for this? Well, we do start with a pitch deck. And that misconception that we must raise venture capital leads to a misconception that the only reason we ever make a pitch deck is that we have to raise money from investors and maybe win competitions. Yes, investment is an important tool for financing. Yes, winning competitions is an important tool for PR and marketing, but that's not the most important use, the most important function of a pitch deck. In my opinion, and this comes from experience and research, the most important function of a pitch deck is for you and your team to have an agreement about what is the market opportunity that you are trying to pursue. I'll give you a really interesting fact that we also learned in the MIT's REAP program. The reason why 70% of venture-funded companies fail is not what you think it should be. Most people would think, it was a technology problem, or it was competition, or it was fundraising, or something else. Those are not the single most important reason. The reason why 70% of venture capital funded companies fail is because of conflict among the founders and early stakeholders. They don't agree on what the market opportunity is and what are the roles, responsibilities, and rewards that each of them is going to get. So teamwork is critical. And the first use of your pitch deck is actually for you to get together with your team and make an agreement. What is that what is the customer's narrative? Present that in the pitch deck. And what are you going to do to validate and take a product to the market that solves that problem, breaking it down into your team roles? So this is the first tool and the first exercise that I think is really important for all entrepreneurs to do when they are first starting to set up a company. Now, Don't spend months on your pitch deck. Do it quickly. Couple of days, a week, get your first version out, and then build a landing page. Build a website. Because it's through this website that you can install the tools that will drive behavioral interactions with your target audience. Oh, but our product is so nice and we don't have a patent and we're worried that people are going to steal our idea. So we don't want to build a website yet. That's what a lot of people say. The thing is, eventually you will have to share your product. You can take your time, definitely consult with a lawyer about any patents you might have to file before you publish about your product, but you don't have to start, and I don't think that your website should start right away necessarily with your product. The more important part is the problem. Share the problem and create content around the problem that you are trying to solve, and help people work through this problem even using existing solutions, because this will allow you to use the technical tools of the internet, your basic analytics, like if you install Google Analytics as a package, or if you use Google Search Console to see what kind of traffic is coming into your website through keyword searches. That search engine traffic and maybe some experiments with like advertisements will really help you to understand whether or not people out there are searching on the internet to solve the problem you are trying to solve. So I think it's critical to have your customer's narrative reflected in your website content. You can install an email capture form so people sign up to your mailing list. And when you do have a product concept that you're ready to share, like we said, put in a payment solution and try to see if you can get some pre-purchase for a very tiny amount. That will give you proof. That is the single most effective, lowest cost way to prove that you actually have a problem people want to be solved. Today, video is critical. You've got to learn how to use video. You don't need fancy cameras. Here we're very lucky to be in a nice studio where we've got some really nice equipment, and the video and audio are coming across crystal clear to you. But when you're just getting started, what's more important than having crystal clear video and audio is the human narrative. Build videos around your customer's problem. This will, again, help you stand out in the field because there's so much content out there. It will help you stand out in the field, and it will help for your audience to start building an idea of who you are as a brand. You know, branding and your positioning in the market is really, really important, and in some cases it's even more important than like filing patents or having the lowest price. In fact, if you develop a great brand and a great way to connect with your customers, you can charge more, and customers are happy to pay more because they know you and they trust you. You can edit video with a smartphone. Remember what I told you, right? We have all of this power in our pockets right now. Smartphone video, you can use that to publish and to make yourself known. And then develop a marketing plan for social media that you execute on. You don't need to spend months. Really spend 1 week and thinking, all right, these are the topics that we want to publish about. And what we're going to do is build a website, put some basic video describing the problem that we have, and we're going to start publishing on social media. If you build a website and put a video and leave it at that, no one's going to come. Nobody's going to see it. You have to actively promote yourself. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, like for international markets are very well known. TikTok has definitely made a big splash around the world. In Korea, we also have Naver cafes, and you have a whole host of other social networking tools that you can use. Publish content on social media to gather attention. That will bring the traffic to your website so that your behavioral tests give you some useful and valuable feedback. And I think that if you can take these steps, this will put you on the first step to validating the market and to create a brand around your solution so that you can eventually begin to sell and begin to drive revenue. So with that said, in the coming days, we will have a chance for me to talk with you one-on-one. I really look forward. I am very thankful and I feel very privileged to be able to be with you in this part of your entrepreneurial journey. And I look forward to see what you will be able to achieve in the next weeks, in the next months, and even throughout the next few years. When we were looking at all of those startup ecosystems in the world, the one important factor that I don't forget is that the single most important part of an innovation ecosystem is the entrepreneurs. And that's you. So we've got to work hard. I hope I can do my best to introduce to you some good skills. I really want, as I said, to meet you one-on-one and help you along in your journey. And when we do have that chance, the one question that I'm going to ask you is, how can I help you? Thank you very much for taking the time today for this. I look forward to seeing you. Bye.